Good afternoon and welcome to the Times Ascent webinar on data analytics. Of course, data analytics as a subject has been a center of attraction for now over 2 decades. It started actually from sports, and then it started seeing its way into the business environment. And not only from the people point of view, it started with marketing and supply chains because they were trying to figure out who are their customers and who are the customers who they should value more, and who are the customers who are likely to buy their product and services. Over a period of time, the same thing moved to supply chains where people started talking about uh, where are my suppliers, how can I get better returns on the things that I want, how can I cultivate an ecosystem of suppliers which will help me do better. And when we started looking at data and what it could do, people were able to show a lot of process efficiencies, people were able to predict the environment, and people were able to do a lot better in their businesses. But when it came to people, things are slightly different because the variables are much different. For example, who is my most valuable employee? It's not an easy answer. Similarly, who is going to attrite soon? Well, you can predict many things, but it's not always easy because we are not able to always predict what's going to happen in future. Similarly, if I have to ask what kind of learning interventions should I throw at somebody, depending on how he or she is learning, it will require me to understand the learning preferences of the person and use that data over a period of time to be able to know what he or she is doing, what he or she is going to do, and therefore predict the kind of interventions that I should be doing. And some of these things, because of the fact that human beings are not 2 by 2 matrix or 3 by 3 matrix, they're much complicated than them, has made data analytics a challenging proposition in HR. So much so that there is a lot of talk about it. But in terms of the question that we're going to answer today is, have we been able to see whether data analytics has been able to deliver the value that it promised? Number one. Number two, we will also see if, for example, if there is value, then what can we do to get started here? And the third thing that we will try and answer today, and this is more from the attendees point of view, is to look at if I want to, for example, get into data analytics, what do I need to do? Who are the people who are good at it and who can build a career? And then from the other side of the game, people who are the users of this data, like HR business partners and other people, we will try and answer the questions as to how they can build on the strength of data analytics to improve their decision making. Now, in order for us to be able to answer some of these questions, we have an eminent panel here. The first panelist that I'm going to introduce is Ramesh Mitrigotri. Now, Ramesh is the CHRO for Ultratech Cement at Aditya Birla Group. He has a pan-industry experience in human resources, and he has served in HR fields across a range of industries, sectors, and in range of organizations which have been owner-driven, family-managed, and professionally run. And not only that, professionally run and multiple country organizations also. And Ramesh happens to be very passionate about driving organizational performance through people, and it'll be interesting to hear his insights in terms of what he thinks is a value that HR analytics can add to us. So Ramesh, if you can wave to the audience will know that I'm talking about you. Our second panelist is Aditya Singh, who is Director of Talent Acquisition at Informatica. Aditya is a talent acquisition professional with a progressive career in multicultural and matrix environment. He has specialized and functional skills that now almost span 2 decades, and he has spanned the entire gamut of talent acquisition during the course of his career. Now, again, from his point of view, there is a blend of working in consulting and multinational organizations that actually helps him answer some questions about how talent analytics can be very useful in talent acquisition. Right. In fact, Aditya is interested not only in talent acquisition, but in global mobility in hiring and consultancy. So Aditya, if you could also just quickly say hi to the audiences, then I will move to Gaurav. Okay. So third panelist is Gaurav. Gaurav actually comes from the other side. He comes from the advisory side of businesses. So he is director of Stratboard Services, and Gaurav has been part of the FMCG retail and financial services industry in India, and he has made marquee contributions to leading organizations like Dabur, Pepsi, Fitness First, and Religare. The Gaurav's biggest strength lies in business HR. He specializes in bringing practical aspects of HR as they exist in the real world and build on the bedrock of solid conceptual frameworks and see how those can be married. Right? And in fact, in addition to being the kind of work that the kind of professional that he is one of the areas that he is very interested in is in FMCG and retail. And most of the attendees would know that FMCG and retail happen to use data analytics a lot. So we would certainly want to draw on Gaurav's expertise in this regard. Right? Now, in order for us to start this, I think what we would also do is we will quickly engage the audience. We will try and ask the audience how they view HR analytics. So let me just do one thing. I'm going to launch a poll. And audiences, this is your turn to respond. We will use the results of the poll to trigger the conversation today. So I've launched the poll. We'll wait for a couple of minutes for audience to respond, and then we will take this forward. So poll is still collecting responses, some interesting responses that we can see. So while we are waiting for people to vote, in fact, I was also looking at some questions. So the panelists, two questions that have already cropped up actually. One is, how will HR benefit? And the second question is interesting, which talks about, is the future of companies' workforce in the hand of analytics? So just keep this in mind, and we will come back to this question as we go along. So we have a good number in terms of completion. So I am going to close the poll. Let's see how the results look like. So looking at this poll, panelists, any opening remarks? So we can start with Gaurav, and then we can just take turns, and then we can continue with the conversation as we go along.
Well, thanks, Pancham. And it's really heartening to see the kind of response that we've gotten here, with 88% people really truly believing in the power of HR analytics. Just a quick anecdote or an analogy that comes to my mind, which will possibly help people understand this context a little more in their real life. So we all, those of us who drive particularly, I'm sure, are using Google Maps for assistance. And if you can go back and remember some of the days when Google Maps wasn't there, and if you were to go a long distance and not familiar with the path, typically, at least I remember so many occasions when one would typically roll down the window and call people on the street to figure out the path, and then possibly take a few wrong turns, eventually get there, and then try and see what happened and what didn't. And that, to me, is the occurrence of Google Maps really is what really signifies the power of analytics. So imagine if before you go anywhere, if you can just simply punch in the location, and you get to see the time and the route, and the distance, etc., that's available. Now that is something what predictive is all about, that there's somebody out there looking at all data points, looking at traffic, looking at bottlenecks on the path, and be able to advise you on the best path to get there. And that's really what predictive is all about. And it doesn't really stop there, because when we move from predictive to really the prescriptive part of analytics, Google does that pretty well as well when it says that, okay, you may be 5 minutes delayed, and there is, by the way, a faster route available, and here you may get lesser traffic, and that to me is prescriptive. So I think that's a brilliant tool that we all use in our daily lives, and I feel that has the power that analytics really holds as far as life and specifically also HR is concerned. So that's the opening remark from my side, and that's the power that we live each day, and I look forward to hearing the views from my co-panelists now.
Well, thank you, Gaurav. So, Aditya, any views? Of course, Gaurav has talked about the power of analytics using a real life example of Google Maps. Any
Yeah.
thoughts from you?
Yeah, so and obviously I completely agree with Gaurav, and a good analogy everybody can understand. Yeah, as you said, analytics is all about three phases, right? Descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive, right? These are the stages from a data analytics side. It's nothing but basically gathering, organizing, and analyzing data, right? And if you look at now in the future, uh, data is the new oil, right? That's the most important part as we go up further to make any decisions, and this will be a very important uh, phase for us in the future. And currently a lot of companies are doing it, and I'm sure once we dwell further into the conversations, we will deep dive into some of those areas. But yeah, completely, I'm happy to see that everybody is in sync with what we all are trying to look at. So
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Aditya. So, Ramesh, any other thoughts from you before we move on with the next one? I think you're on mute, Ramesh. We can't hear you.
Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I think 88% have already said it. That's the way. Human mind historically has always never been in isolation. They've always been predicting and correlating it to multiple things happening, including, at one stage they tried looking at stars and tried to define what was going to happen to their lives. Right? So analytics is natural into a human being of trying to do it. In current business context and ways of processing data faster, I think it's come to the fore and it's become very important of how do we make use of it. We can analyze that data faster, look at discrete pieces of data, make meaning out of it, and then that is what is going to build in. And it's a huge opportunity for businesses. It's a huge opportunity for any activity that we do. And I think Gaurav, in a very simplistic way, actually explained to all of us, saying how Google is changing our lives in that. So you see many of the things that are happening, even the advertisements that get thrown at us, right? All of them, they are picking discrete pieces of data and bringing back to us. Analytics is here to stay. That's actually going to be the future in which we're going to be operating on, and very well put by Aditya. It's the future oil data. And what do we do with it is entirely in our hands. The big challenge before us, are we going to use it ethically? Are we going to use it unethically? I think those are the big changes and things that we need to build as foundations for tomorrow.
In fact, Ramesh, thanks a lot. You brought out some very important points about the correct use of any data and insight from that, because any such knowledge has the potential to be misused, and we have to make sure that we don't do that. Now, in order to make sure that whatever we are talking about is also relatable to the audience that is in play, one of the things that we always do is we look at who are the kind of people who have joined us. So what we will do quickly is in the next 2 minutes, we'll quickly throw two polls which will help us understand, one, what level of experience are we talking about here. So I'm going to launch that poll. Audiences, it is actually for you to respond. So what is your level of experience in terms of years? And then I will follow through this with another poll in a minute. So far, it appears to be people with 3+ years of experience. That's what a majority of our audiences is about. Interesting. So from panelists' point of view, I think this insight is going to help us at least in framing our responses, because I think most of the people, because they have had experience, they will be able to relate to the examples that we will talk about when we get down further into the conversation. So in fact, I'm just about to close the poll and then share the results, and then we'll move to the next question, because that will also help us understand not only in terms of length of experience, but also the kind of experience that people have. So if you see, broadly speaking, around 88% people are 3+ years of experience, which is actually interesting. Right? So experienced set of people. Now let's look at one more data point, because that will help us understand to what extent the people in the audience would be well versed with the subject of analytics. So audiences, one more question for you, please. Interesting. So here actually, while people have a lot of experience, but the majority of the people are users of HR analytics, but they are not themselves in the HR analytics department. And then we have another significant set of people who are not working in HR analytics at the moment, but they plan to do that as we go along. So I'm about to close the poll, so at least we will be able to get. So panelists, you can see the results, right? So 9% of the people in terms of attendance are people who are part of the HR analytics team. Around 23% of the people are those people who want to get into analytics, but at the moment they are not. More than half the people are those people who actually are not in HR analytics, but users of analytics, and they would like to know how best they can use the power of something like this. So that actually helps us understand who are the people who are coming and talking to us. So now, so looking at the composition of the audiences, 3+ years of experience, and majority of the people who are actually going to be users of HR data, but not maybe themselves people who will do HR analytics. If I were to ask you, Ramesh, in fact, you would have seen some amount of work in your organization. So what has been the biggest challenge when you decided to start out in the field of using data to make decisions?
Pancham, I think first and foremost is sufficiency of data. I mean, you would capture in the, for analytics, it takes that data resides somewhere in a place on a system that you can utilize it, right? And the first issue that the challenge that we came across is availability of enough data to be able to start looking at. Second is ability to connect data. Let's say on one hand we have people data, and connecting people data to other parts of the organization, things like your sales, business, to a limited purpose for incentive design, etc. You have that, but going beyond to put deeper predictability, I think sufficiency of data was the first issue. That was the first challenge, to build it up. Second was, of course, you may have started building the data maybe a year ago or 2 years ago for the kind of data that you need. Historical data doesn't exist, right? So recreating that data itself is a big challenge of how do you start putting it together. The other parts of it is, sometimes data is there, but you don't have the right people to figure out and put it down together. So the early part, when we ventured out into this area of even analyzing and throwing insights to us itself was a challenge in the beginning, which over the last few years that has come to the fore. You have experts in the field who can actually do that. But that was also the initial challenges that we faced when we actually began looking at these pieces of information. Second, there are always skeptics when you start off. So there was, even in the organization, there was a lot of skepticism to say that, look, this looks something fancy. Is that worth the investment you want to do? So some proof of concept and actually the first quick hits had to be really materialized before it got accepted as a normal way of life. So these are, some of the top of mind challenges that I encountered in practice when we saw that.
Oh, interesting, Ramesh. In fact, I think we all talk about this, that when we start any journey, one of the biggest challenges is to make sure that the data is in place. Having said that, Gaurav, because you would be working with multiple organizations, you would have seen many organizations. Would you have examples of organizations in India who would have maybe overcome this challenge without much hassle?
Yeah, Pancham, I think every need leads to some invention, and I think while the need for analytics is growing, there is also deep realization and possibly a common challenge that organizations face today, which is data being either siloed or residing in multiple data sources. And there is clearly a need of a tool or a layer of analytics which can actually consume data from various such uh,
Mhm.
data points and then still be able to, without really organizations having to part ways with the systems they are using, use the same technology that they've been using and put a layer on top of that so that at least something can happen. So yes, there are organizations which have uh, very actively started looking at these kind of solutions.
Hmm. So basically, what you're saying is that if they have 10 different systems, they actually build a layer of data where all the systems actually are sending data to a lake, maybe a data lake, and from the data lake, you are actually looking at conducting analysis. Hmm.
Absolutely.
Ah,
So it's a
interesting.
topical layer. It doesn't change your bedrock of data, but serves your purpose.
Interesting. Well, thanks, Gaurav. So now, in fact, there is a question that people have asked, and one question that is recurring now is, how will people benefit from it? So now, actually, I will turn to you, Aditya, to see, have you, for example, can you give us an example of how you have used data? In fact, there is a very specific question that somebody has asked about using data to negotiate better from a recruiter's point of view with candidates. So, so that's a
Okay.
use case of analytics. But it'll be interesting to know, how you have used data to do anything, not only negotiation, but any other thing better in recruitment.
So, okay, so one is, if I break down your question, is one, try and look at what from an HR standpoint is beneficial. Why are we doing analytics from an HR standpoint? Obviously, and looking at talent acquisition, how do we use it more effectively from a talent acquisition operations perspective, right?
Mhm.
All right. So if you look at HR, HR, I think HR will obviously benefit out of it, because there are multiple areas which analytics can help. It will help improve performance. It gives time to HR being far more strategic. We're able to identify not the best talent, but then look at talent which will stay in the organization for a period of time. You will understand what motivates people, look at quality of hire, identifying various patterns of high performers, right? And so it's all about one, questioning, then looking at data selection, data cleaning. I think we were speaking about it earlier, and data analysis, and then obviously building an insight about it. To the question on talent acquisition, how do we use it very effectively? In a negotiation, it not exactly a negotiation, but then it's very easy for you to understand the candidate pretty well. One, like I'll give you an example. What we do very predictively and easily is from a campus hire perspective, right? We've been hiring a set of batches from various different campuses, but then how do you make sure that they are the best talent which you've been hiring, right? So we look at their performance, we look at how they have been doing in the organization for a period of time, how long has there been the length of their tenure, how as what's the term of promotion for them in the organization, right? So we look at all of that for us to give throwback information back to recruiting of saying that, hey, I think you should look at this because there are a set of people who do very well in the organization vis-a-vis these, and this set of people will stay in the organization for this particular skill. So we use a lot of this data to go back and make intelligent decisions on any of the hire. It also talks about quality of hire, which I talked about earlier from a recruiting angle. Also from a lateral perspective, it's predominantly, again, we also look at a lot of inputs from which companies have we hired from, where are we from a percentile perspective, from a comp perspective in the market against them, are we able to attract talent from them, number of people who applied from predominantly which tier companies are they applying. So where is market positioning us, where are we from a market perspective, bridging the gap, all of this information, even in talent acquisition, and I'm sure both the panelists will agree, a lot of data is there, right? So you can, that's easier to pull out a lot of things and make informed decisions. But the only problem is marrying most of the systems together to making sure that you are able to infer some amount of information out of it. Yeah.
No, Aditya, you talked about something very interesting actually, and
Yep.
in one of the webinars that I was moderating, I was speaking to the HR head of Cisco. And she talked about a very interesting practice that they started when you looked at data, and we were discussing the concept of unbiasing, very linked to data. So they talked about the fact that there was a preconceived notion about hiring from a particular institution or a set of organizations, and then what they did was they did blind testing. So they masked the education and everything, and they only kept the skill sets, and then they asked the assessors to come and look at selecting these people without knowing which institutions they passed out from or which companies they worked from. They only knew these skills, and they went through multiple tests, and they figured that the hypothesis that they wanted to test was that it is not the college or the companies that people come from that mattered in that particular domain, but it is the skill that is required that mattered the most for success. And when they did the blind test, they found out that if, for example, when the same hiring was done without the blind test, none of those people who eventually got hired even got shortlisted. And then they used some of these very interesting insights into completely changing the way they hire, and the entire hypothesis, for example, was proven right, that it's the college or the company did not matter for that particular role for them. Of course, we cannot generalize it, but that was one example that came to mind because I suddenly recalled that they actually did something like that.
Funny part is now organizations have flipped it. You're talking from an organization perspective. What organization has also flipped it from a candidate perspective, because a lot of for technical hiring we do give that coding test. I'm sure all of us are aware. Now companies are using gaming as a technology. You
Correct.
Don't know, right? So you have to your individual self will come out, and then they look at whether it marries to what you're looking from an organization perspective. And I agree with you. A lot of organizations are looking at unbiased approach of hiring.
In fact, that was one thing that I recall based on what you talked about. So Ramesh, of course, in IT and IT enabled services, we find that the job libraries are very well defined. We are still on the subject of hiring. So we know that if I, for example, use any AI based tool, it will help me predict who are the people who I should be able to shortlist and hire over a period of time. But let's say in sales, in HR itself, for example, if I have to look at somebody, and if I were to only use an AI based tool, which is completely enabled with data, a lot of data, I'm still not able to make a very high quality of prediction or highly accurate prediction. So how do you, for example, use data, and how, when you know that data is not sufficient, what else do you do to make sure that the decisions are still right?
From a 100% intuition based decision, earlier the person would get met by a few people and it's their intuition, right? I wouldn't say right or wrong, but they would make basis some data points of theirs, make a decision of it. Now that is getting supplemented with a lot of information about the candidate, and both the role is profiled in a manner that, so what are the data points that we of the job that we look at, and how do we make a person match to that, and what are the data points we can gather even before the intuitive part really comes in. Right? So, whether it's psychometry, whether it is, your screening tests and the background profiling and all of that coming in gives you a whole lot of input. And what you termed earlier as, removing biases, these are the parts that actually help it putting everybody on a equal platform when you do the filtration. And yet for roles like HR or where, full data driven hasn't come in, the element of intuition is reduced to a small extent. It's the final call that you've got to take. If all things being given equal, what do you apply your weightages on to pick someone? And that's what's happening. In fact, even to do that, I think more and more data points as we go on searching, I think those will also get more and more defined to say that how do we predict them early on, so that the last part is it's just a managerial call to be taken at the end. Right? So I think it's more and more developing. It's not yet a fully developed kind of an area. The challenge also is, as you are kind of freezing in, the roles itself are undergoing a huge change.
Correct.
Right? And so the pace has to be constantly kept on to catch up with that.
No, in fact, Ramesh, you talked about something very interesting, and based on what you just talked about, I will direct the next question at Gaurav. So, to Gaurav, Ramesh spoke about two very critical things. One is about the fact that data will not always give you 100% accuracy. So and that is not the only thing that you will rely on. You will use that data. You will use some other variables which are not talked about in the data, and then you will use a judgment. Now, in order for, let's say, HR to say that we are using analytics, one of the important things is to first train the HR folks into use of data, what is the right use of data and what is not, and more importantly also to educate the business managers to start using that data to make decisions. So have you seen use cases where companies have done a very good or a very bad job? Of course, we know that we don't want you to name the companies, but only learnings are important from our point of view.
Yeah, interesting question, I must say, Pancham. And it's true. I mean, organizations today don't have a lot of data from the past for them to be able to really predict what's going to happen in the future. So data, there's always a dearth of it. And there are occasions where we have seen, without, like you said, naming the organizations, where we've had um, organizations approach us, let's say, to address one of the biggest questions, which is to possibly, let's say, predict attrition. And one of the use cases they would typically say is that while we'll have, let's say, performance data or maybe some sentiment data from engagement tools and stuff like that, but is there data sourcing available which you can do from the social web? Because imagine if today you are disengaged and you want to really start looking out, possibly you will start getting more active on LinkedIn, you will start getting more active on some other portals, and a lot of such portals especially exist on the IT side, where you see that now, but challenge there is the whole element of privacy and the whole element of the GDPR laws and those things which are coming in, as to what extent can you get into peeping inside what individuals are doing in their personal lives, and where should organizations really be able to draw the line. I think that's a classic dilemma, and a lot of projects, even while there could be data available in the outside world, can organizations really leverage that data? And if yes, to what extent, is a question that all of us are yet to answer.
No, you're right, actually, because I think as things unfold, I think we will know more about how better we were able to improve productivity, how better we were able to manage costs. And actually, that is one question that somebody has actually asked. Neha has asked this question: how do you how do you negotiate benefit offerings and optimize employee costs as you go along? So we talked about negotiation from a recruitment point of view. But Aditya, for example, since you've been talking about talent acquisition a lot, so for example, have you been able to show a tangible saving in cost per hire by using data? And if yes, can you share the learnings with others? Because I'm sure there are quite a few people who would have similar questions.
Yes, and yes, I've obviously shown, and the the simplest way out is you know we hire a lot of folks, and for the last 3.5 years, all the hiring is done by internally by the team. So the cost to pay out to an agency is zero. While I have hired people, but we were able to look at cost per hire, which is far more lower as compared to the payout from an agency perspective. So that was one area which was an extensive input back, right? Even from a talent attraction perspective, it's far more easier from an employee and from a recruiter standpoint to do a extensive branding of an organization vis-a-vis working with an agency, because the agency would work at multiple people, multiple clients at the same time. So cost per hire, I think is a very simple way which we have looked at from an effective utilization. Secondly is also increase in the dent from an employee referral standpoint, not only from a cost standpoint, because from a payout perspective, while it's good, but we've done an analysis of seeing people who get referred actually stay in the organization for a longer period of time, vis-a-vis people coming from other channels of hiring, because they would want to stick around for a longer period of time. So these are two broader parameters which have obviously helped us to push through more internal hiring and obviously push through more employee referrals, so that we end of the day, no organization wants to extensively hire. They would want to hire limited set of people and also cross utilize people inside. So that's the situation we would want to be in.
In fact, thanks, Aditya. You talked about very interesting thing, which is about cross skilling. So, Ramesh, there are two questions that I'm loading in one for you. So, one is, of course, so Aditya spoke about how changing the sources of hire helped save costs. That was one. The second is there is a huge cost involved, which people don't normally realize, which is the infancy attrition. Now, a lot of HRBPs would normally struggle with that issue. I hire somebody, and in the first year or in the first 18 months, before I'm able to recover the total cost of hiring plus paying plus the fully loaded cost of the seat, the person goes. And if that number is big, then clearly somehow my decisions are suboptimal. That is one question. The second thing, of course, is related to this. Now, so the first is, how do we make sure that we actually use data to reduce infancy attrition, number one, and number two, instead of therefore looking out where we know that the probability of getting a wrong hire would be higher, how can data help us look at potential pool of people who I can cross skill, thereby reducing my let's say reliance on external hiring?
Excellent. I think early attrition or infant attrition, I think, is a big cost that often doesn't go measured by organizations.
Correct.
And one of the things, my own experience in one of the organizations, I work for a retail organization, and this was a very high number. So we actually went to several data points of looking at what really is the cause of the attrition. And there are few parameters that we looked in multiplicity. Are there any specific time periods that this happens in during, let's say, the first year? Are there specific time periods, or is it a general scatter all across? Are there any events that are linked to those time periods that is happening? Is it happening under specific managers or a specific geographical place? All of those parameters actually help us pinpoint some hypothesis that we could make, saying what's really happening. And that, once those three of the big items got addressed, we suddenly saw a drastic drop in how early attrition we could arrest. Yeah, and it's not necessarily to do with that small part. We actually tweaked who we hire, how we hire, and how we onboard. All of them become an important part to really arrest what happens once they come on board. Yeah, and it's a very important element, and I can go on. Whether it is in the sales force, whether it is in the frontline manufacturing place, it's worked very well all across. What we need is to delve in and gather as many data points as we can, look at correlations of what we are happening. when I said to a specific time period of when attrition happens, right, there were certain periods at the end of the month, right, or during the weekends when the retail sales would be high, you would suddenly find attrition happening at that period. It gave us a clue to start looking at what really happens, what really kind of irks people to start not appearing to work the next morning. And that gave us very interesting insights to really being able to plug in, which is on one part of what you just said. Sorry, what was your second question while answering
That
that?
was
Just
about learning, cross skilling.
yeah, on the skilling part, I think here is where you know there is an element of growth that we look at for people in the organization, right? How one has to grow, because usually in the simpler sense, it used to be a linear growth. If you're a frontline salesperson, you become an area manager, you become and so and so. And there is a good adage to that says that you lost a good salesman and created a bad manager, right? And and often when you do this intuitively, that's what happens. There is a structured way of actually analyzing are the what are the traits that the person is showing that makes the person go wider. And we actually have customized inputs for individual skilling to say that it's not one glove fits all and put the person into a common pool of training, but specifically focus on areas where he or she needs the most. And we focus on, we look at if these are the three primary strengths that work very well for the individual, look at them and reinforce those to manage the other development areas, not plug or invest into the development areas to start working on. So that's primarily, now here are a whole lot of inputs that we gather about the individual and then make meaning out of it of what needs to be done.
In fact, you talked about something very interesting, Ramesh. So for the benefit of audience, what I'm going to do is quickly summarize what Ramesh spoke about. About infancy attrition, one of the first things is to start measuring it, because most of the people don't look at that, and we don't realize the costs associated with it, number one. The second thing is, when we start looking at attrition going beyond the usual reasons, we need to start looking at when is it happening. The timing is important. In fact, in an industry like yours, which is cement is a cyclical industry. And I'm sure there are many other industries which would also have a cycle. So if, for example, the attrition is suddenly very high in the peak of the cycle, then you know that there is a potential poaching happening. Or if the attrition is still very high in the trough, then you may have a situation where people are leaving the industry completely. Therefore, the question from HR business partners and people who are looking at exits, and also the talent acquisition people, is to start looking at what is causing the attrition. The cause is important if we have to really address it. So that is one lesson that you talked about. The second thing that you talked about in terms of cross skilling is look at how and who are the people who are candidates for growth in the organization, and what do they need to succeed. There is no point bombarding them with hundreds of competencies or micro learning interventions. Look at 3 areas and just focus on those, and then you pick the next 3 areas. But how do you arrive at that area, and how do you arrive at who are the candidates for that particular intervention will require careful analysis of data, performance, and many other things. So that's what Ramesh spoke about. This is for the benefits of others. Now, there is another related question, Gaurav. So that's a question that I'm going to put at you. So we have so far talked about attrition, infancy attrition. To some extent, we've talked about growth. Now, one area where people have asked this question is how can, for example, Anurag has asked this question, how can we use analytics in managing performance? While Anurag's question was about performance improvement plans, but I'm extending the question to performance management because I believe there is enough use case that can be built in terms of performance management using analytics.
So I think one of the largest use cases of HR analytics is in the areas we've spoken. And performance, clearly, I mean, there's correlation to state that organizations who are on the path of HR analytics are doing well from a top line perspective and a bottom line perspective and are even being considered better employers. So I think as Ramesh ji was mentioning a while back, the same applies to this thing. The journey starts with really measurement of data. Now, one of the challenges typically we see from a performance standpoint is that performance, and especially if I look at let's say sales performance or manufacturing performance. Now these um, at least in the Indian context, are considered little more owned by line heads or sales heads. And I think one of the larger problems really HR currently faces is to be able to build those relationships and get access to all the data that HR needs to be able to marry business results with the other HR data available. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. And organizations who've been able to successfully get access, and when we say HR's seat on the table, that's really the whole journey. That when HR is deeply involved in performance reviews and is not considered as an outsider who would just be looking at the ratings at the end of the year, but somebody who's nurturing performance management as the dialogues happen, whether it's on a monthly basis or journey cycle meets in the FMCG context. And I think there are classic examples of organizations where true business HR has established its seat on the table in performance dialogues, and then there is no challenge of data, and you could build beautiful use cases and correlations, and the whole. I think the secret to success lies in that simple answer, as far as that is concerned.
Well, thanks, Gaurav. You touched upon a very interesting point. And now this is Anurag. I hope that you've got your answer and others too. Having said that, I think another important thing that, based on the conversations that we have had so far, I've also gathered is in performance management. I think one of the biggest questions that people have been asking is the bell curve going, or is it the bell curve, or is it something else? Do we have conversations and do we not? So a lot of people have talked about now power law instead of the bell curve and so forth. But the important thing for each one of us to look at is, for example, what drives performance. And I think if using data we are able to figure out what causes performance, chances are you will not have to put anybody in the performance improvement plan. That will help you hire the right people, that will help you grow the right people, because these are the people who will be your most valuable players at the end of the day. For example, there was somebody who was asking me this question in one of the conversations that I was having. He says, I have two sets of people. There is a set of people who have been with us for more than 10 years, have been performing consistently. Then there is another set of people who have come in the last 2 years, and they have performed exceptionally well in the last year. Who do I reward more? Now, this is a classic situation for anyone, because you have limited budgets and you have to make a call. And therefore, who do you reward more? And at the risk of antagonizing the other one, and so on and so forth. Some of these are actually real-time questions that HR business partners, business managers will face. And data analytics can actually help you. How they can help you is very simply by asking you to put a weightage. Do you put more weightage to one-time performance or contribution over a period of time? And when you start actually using some formula, when you start creating some equations, you would start to, it's very similar to a budget line in economics. So when you actually look at, because your budget line is your total budget, then you say, who do you value more, a one-off exorbitant performance or consistent solid performance? You will be able to draw some econometric analysis, and you will be able to reach somewhere where you know that you have optimized the budget and everybody is happy. So yes, some of these use cases exist, and I think it's for us to start looking at some of these use cases. And on that note, actually, I wanted to also now transition from multiple different examples of how people can use it to answering another question, which most of the people would have. For example, most of us are not actually data analytics professionals. Some of us, actually, majority of the people are users of data. I think we have covered quite a bit for them. But there is another set of people who want to do this, who want to get started with that. So if you were to give an advice to them, what would that be? So Aditya, I would start with you, and then we will move to the next one. So let's say if I am a person, let's say I'm a recruiter, And now I have, having seen this webinar and having seen some use cases of talent acquisitions, there is a lot of interest I've created now in data analytics. And maybe I see myself making a career there. So what do I do starting today that will help me move there?
Yeah, and I think in irrespective of whatever role we do, it's very important to be a data. You should be able to infer data, irrespective of the role which you do. The percentage might vary, but in simple in recruiting, they say if you can't do VLOOKUP, HLOOKUP, and pivot, then you are in trouble. So as simple as that. But some of those things which I feel is very important for this role is one, you should have the ability to define problem. Should be in a position to hypothesize, uh, ability to project manage, and then solution it, right? Obviously, you need to be in a position where you keep your stakeholders involved. Remember, it's a very simple logic of data analysis and data interpretation, right? It's very important that you have the ability as an individual to one, play around with data, do it yourself, and then analyze, and then predict. Okay, and then obviously prescribe is a very a further step up. It's predict itself takes a lot of time. To prescribe gives a consultative approach. So get into a position where you are able to do this. And if you look at two steps behind, like a leader, you should be able to story tell it, visualize it, write it, project it, and market it. Right? These are the skills I feel is very important. Briefly, from my end.
Oh, well, thanks, Aditya. You talked about something interesting. So you said that, we don't all have to become experts in R or Python overnight. While that may be something that we may want to do over a period of time, but getting started with some good, solid use of a simple tool like Excel is also a good beginning, because now even Excel actually has some amazing data analytics tools available within it. You can actually run discrete distribution probabilities. You can run concrete, even continuous distribution probabilities, and so on and so forth. So yes, that makes a lot of sense. So for those of us who want to get started, that's a good beginning. Let's start looking at the data and let's start asking some questions. That will help. So Ramesh, a similar question to you, although because the question about maybe using data from TA point of view has been answered, there is one question that has come up, and that question is, how do we use HR analytics in learning and development? Now, if let's look at a learning professional. Now, if you were to give an advice as to what can they do, what data can they look at to help learning become better as a function, more efficient and more effective, what would that be? And the answer that we are seeking is from the point of view of a non-data analytics professional.
I think learning traditionally, if we look at learning as a activity, we assess the training requirements or training needs, converted them into training medium or programs, or and then went on to delivery, and then measured the impact of it. Traditionally that has been happening for years as a flow in the organization. While it does, to an extent, like our educational degrees, that does something as a basics or a foundation, but does that really make an impact of what you want? Because as we move along with the pace of change, the skills acquisition, we want it faster and faster, better retention, and a quick practice or application. Now, how will we ensure as to what is needed, right? And second is more and more of customization. What works for you as a way of learning may not work for me and may not work for someone else, right? So is there a ability to customize it so that the absorption is faster and the application is quicker of what we do? And my own learning style, my own application style, if one has insights, they could customize the delivery for them. That's why for example, at the simplest, there are some people who can naturally read and understand. There are some people who would like to hear and understand. Some people would like to do and learn it. traditional methods, putting everyone in a classroom or sending everyone to a lab, actually misses out on these individuals of what they could be better ways of learning. So can we customize so that we have more emphasis on what is their natural way of learning and the others become incidental for them to refer to? I think one of the ways for learning professionals is to start looking at it. People are looking at, and I think the pandemic and then, the virtual medium reach itself has posed a big challenge. And it's also a big opportunity to say that how can we actually build customization? How can we transfer the customization in the hands of the user? Let the user define how and what they want, and then we can start beginning to customize it. So
In fact,
I don't
you
know
talked
whether
about
that
something
was a
very,
full answer.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, you actually talked about something very interesting, when you talked about learning styles and how I learn and everything. I think so. While all the learning professionals know that there used to be something called Kolb's learning style, then there are multiple intelligences by Howard Gardner and so on and so forth. But the fact is that not many HR organizations have created what we call personas, the way a marketing organization creates. So they have been able to create personas, and then they know that, for example, let's say I am a 45-year-old person. My needs are to actually come in the classroom. I'm an auditory learner. That means I would like to have conversations and discuss and learn. I learn best by doing that. um, and on the other hand, there is a 24-year-old person who is actually mobile native almost, spends majority of the time on smartphone, and actually would prefer everything to be thrown at the smartphone so that one can take it. So do you train both the people using, even if you're taking the same skill, do you train them in the similar fashion? You wouldn't. For example, you will have a classroom program for somebody saying that, why don't you come to the classroom? On the other hand, for a person who is a tech native, I will maybe create a quiz on Mentimeter or some other learning tool like a Slido or something. I'll create a quiz, I will gamify it so that this person learns exactly the same things that the other person is learning in the class. So that is the level of customization that analytics can help us. But for that, we have to have a lot of information and data about our people, use that to draw personas, and then start looking at which employee fits into which persona, and therefore how can I customize my learning intervention for them. And that's the essence of analytics, that you are actually using data to answer some of the questions that we know always intuitively, but we have never used maybe a scientific analysis to now start answering, and maybe aggregating some questions from different fields and then answering the question, how do I do my job better? So that's what I hope, Anurag, your question has been answered. And now, from the point of view of, see, what we have talked about is data, a lot of data. There is one question that has come up, that small organizations, 50 people, how can they use analytics? So Gaurav, any thoughts on that? Because there is a question that people have asked this.
Sure. So I think the science remains the same, and you have to start looking at more granular. I mean, I would say it's more advantageous when you're a smaller team. I would say your assumptions would tend to get a little more sharper, because if you're a smaller team, you would know them a lot more, and you would be able to align better as far as the hypothesis is concerned, as far as the assumptions are concerned, as far as uh, defining the end goal for the analytics is concerned, the business case is concerned. So I think as far as the data is concerned, so I would say I would really encourage small organizations to start early on, because the goal which you where you want to go, the data that you need for getting there, the hypothesis, the alignment, the team, everything is to your advantage. And do not really wait for um, really high-end BI tools or AI tools or ML tools. You can start with simple Excel if so be it. The idea is that it has to deliver. You have to deliver value to the business, and analytics necessarily doesn't mean that we fall fancy with all the terms that larger organizations use today. And that's really what my key message to them is, that you don't need to be a great practitioner if you don't have the Excel skills. So it's okay, you can get somebody else, build a cross-functional team. You at least know the organization needs, and you at least know human behavior. So I think that's how I'd like to respond to that.
Well, thanks a lot, Gaurav. In fact, we always talk about the fact that from HR's point of view, practitioner's point of view, we may not have the technical skill, not all of us, but we certainly have to cultivate the skill to ask the right questions, because your hypothesis testing starts with asking the right questions. Otherwise, it will always become a problem, right? So
Pancham,
that's one.
I'll just yeah, I'll just jump in to add. I think Gaurav put it very well. Whether it is 50 people or 500 people, actually that doesn't matter. It's
Correct.
every organization has a defined success metrics of what it wants to do, right? And it is HR person has to understand the linkages of what metrics they are measuring that impact the success metrics of the organization, and that alone will start giving them, when they start putting in the factors that go into impact these metrics, it will help. So longitudinally, they can start looking at those.
In fact, thanks a lot, Ramesh. You've actually talked about it. We have to start now. I mean, there is no tomorrow. We have to start now. And then over a period of time, we will have enough data that we can start looking at how data has changed and how our business environment has changed, and allow us to make a lot of sense out of what it is. So now at this time, because of the time that we are already clocking 5:02, so we don't have a lot of time. So what I wanted to do was to check audience sentiment in terms of after listening to the conversation today, how do they respond to this question? So audience, there's a small poll coming to you. The poll is, having listened to the conversation, where do you think HR analytics can play most important part? Okay, so we have an interesting. So I'm closing the poll. I'm looking at what people are saying. So I've just shared the results of the poll for everybody. So it's actually interesting because normally people would say that attrition when hiring is where analytics play a huge part. But we see that there are people who are now talking about rewards and how analytics can help in rewards. They can talk about career growth. Although learning, we still have a minority, but hopefully, at least in the other areas, we would have given you enough answers. We know that there is a time constraint. Having said that, I hope that today we were able to give you some examples, some questions, some ways you can actually get started. For instance, when we start looking at analytics, it is not only about using very smart and big data tools. Excel itself is a good starting point. From HR practitioner's point of view, asking the right questions for testing the right hypothesis is important. And then to look at all the data and making sure that there is enough insight that is enough insight that comes out of data, and that insight has to be acted upon. The other important thing that from HR managers and HR practitioners point of view is, if we want to get started, there is no point doing a huge launch about some of these things. We can get started in small pockets. However, when we get started, first, all the HR people have to be trained in the value that the data brings, number one. Second, when you want to deploy it for any business has to see value. For example, it's the same business that uses data to look at their customers, to look at who their key customers are, to look at where actually their revenue is going to come from, or where their costs are going to go going forward. There is no reason why they cannot use data to look at who are the people, who will be our best bets going into the future, and how we can maximize our investments on people. I'm sure if we pitch it like that, there is no manager who will say no to it. But it's a journey. The journey starts today. And from HR's point of view, whether we are in the field of analytics or not, I think we all have to understand numbers. We all have to know how to derive some of these numbers. We all have to start learning maybe some other disciplines. For example, econometrics. A lot of examples from behavioral economics are now coming into HR. A lot of examples from statistics are coming into HR. Any greenbelt project would actually have a lot of descriptive statistics that will come into it, and a lot of probability also going forward. So unless we know some of these things, it is not going to be easy for us to add value and also ask the right questions going forward, right? And therefore, from HR's point of view, look at what are the lessons we can learn from other industries. Look at what are the lessons we can learn from other disciplines. How can we become more numeral centered, and how can we educate our business managers and ourselves continuously is actually the name of the game. On that note, I would like to thank the three panelists and really appreciate the time you took. We really had a good time. I hope that you were able to get the questions that were challenging for you, and also you were able to share your expertise with all of us. And I hope that the audience was able to get the answers to some of the questions that they were asking. On that note, thanks a lot, and we will sign off.
Thank you, Pancham.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thanks, Aditya.
Thanks.